the world watches, transfixed, as conflicts erupt and societies fracture. We see enemies, we draw lines, we build walls of ideology and fear. But what happens when the carefully constructed image of an enemy begins to crumble, not under the force of arms, but under the quiet, persistent weight of human decency? What happens when the expected hatred never materializes, replaced instead by a simple, disarming kindness? This isn't just a philosophical question. It's a lived reality, a profound historical paradox that reveals the hidden resilience of the human spirit in the darkest of times. Today, we delve into a story from the heart of World War II, a narrative so unexpected, so counterintuitive to the brutal logic of conflict, that it challenged everything men believed about war, about their enemies, and ultimately about themselves. It's the story of Japanese prisoners of war, men who had fought with unwavering conviction and been indoctrinated with fierce ideology, finding themselves in the American heartland, anticipating the very worst, only to confront a truth far more unsettling than any battlefield defeat: the silent, unwavering humanity of ordinary people, farmers in the shadow of Pearl Harbor. This is a story about the cognitive dissonance that erupts when reality violently clashes with propaganda, about the slow, painful dismantling of hatred and the quiet power of empathy to disarm more deeply than any weapon. It is a testament to the enduring, almost inconvenient truth that even in the crucible of total war, the essence of humanity can persist, finding fertile ground in the most unlikely of places. Imagine, if you can, the profound psychological torment endured by these Japanese soldiers. They were products of an imperial system, steeped in the warrior code of Bushido, a philosophy that extolled loyalty, courage, and above all, honor. Surrender, in their cultural framework, was not merely a military setback. It was an act of profound shame, a stain on their family, their ancestors, and their nation. They were taught that to be captured was to forfeit one's right to dignity, to become less than human. The very act of laying down arms, of surviving rather than dying in battle, was a contradiction to their core beliefs. For these men, captivity was a fate worse than death, a personal and collective humiliation. They fully expected, indeed were prepared for, the most brutal treatment imaginable. Propaganda had painted a vivid picture of the American enemy. Ruthless, vengeful, without honor, they envisioned torture, starvation, public humiliation, a prolonged agony that would serve as a perverse confirmation of their own dishonored state. This wasn't mere speculation. It was the logical conclusion of their indoctrination, a narrative deeply ingrained in their psyche. Then came the train journey. Across the vast, alien landscape of the American Midwest, the endless stretches of cornfields, the sturdy red barns standing sentinel against impossibly wide skies. This was not the war-torn, familiar terrain of the Pacific Islands, nor the urban sprawl they might have imagined of America. This was a land of agricultural abundance, of peace and quiet industry, starkly contrasting with the raging conflict they had just left. Through the small barred windows, they pressed their faces, stunned. The sheer scale, the orderly prosperity was bewildering. They were rolling deeper into the land of their sworn enemy, a land they had been told was populated by a vengeful populace, eager to exact retribution for the attack on Pearl Harbor, an act that had ignited American fury and drawn the nation into the global conflagration. The men whispered. their voices hushed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. These Greenlands, as they perceived them, must surely conceal hidden cruelties, a subtle, insidious form of vengeance. They had heard the rumors, the hushed stories before their capture. Americans would starve prisoners, humiliate them, or worse. The echoes of December 1941, the smoke rising from Battleship Row, the sailors dying in the inferno. These images surely burned fiercely in the American mind. How could a kindness possibly be expected from a people who had suffered such a wound? They pictured angry mobs, fists raised, insults hurled, waiting at every station, ready to demand their pound of flesh. Yet, as the train slowed, drawing close to the small towns along the route, a different scene unfolded. American civilians gathered at crossings stood watching. Some were accompanied by children who waved, not in defiance, but with an almost innocent curiosity. There were no spitting, no shouting, just gazes, a mix of wonder, caution, and something else, an unsettling lack of overt hostility. This silent observation, this absence of the expected rage, was deeply unnerving. It was not the hatred they had been prepared for. It was a void where hatred should have been, a question mark hovering over their ingrained beliefs. When the train finally pulled into the guarded compound, surrounded by the stark reality of barbed wire, the men braced themselves for the inevitable blows, the jeers, the final descent into the abyss of their captivity. Instead, American guards, their voices firm but devoid of cruelty, barked orders. They were given rations, simple bread, potatoes, and even meat, and shown to their barracks. The food was a shock. Many had anticipated starvation, yet what was offered was plentiful, especially compared to the severe shortages they knew their families were enduring back in war-torn Japan. The barracks were Spartan, but the bunks were clean, and each man received blankets. This dissonance, this profound disconnect between expectation and reality, continued to grow. Why would the enemy care if they slept well? Why would they feed them adequately? Over the first nights, the prisoners lay awake, the unfamiliar symphony of cicadas buzzing in the fields outside the camp, the distant hum of tractors in the early morning filling the silence. They whispered, their voices low, trying to decipher the meaning of their strange predicament. Some believed it was merely a temporary deception, a cunning psychological ploy, that the true cruelty would inevitably reveal itself once they were put to work. Others, more pragmatic, noted the guards' discipline and posited that perhaps the Americans simply intended to exploit them for labor before discarding them, a utilitarian approach to their existence. A few, recalling the fierce propaganda of the Japanese army that painted Americans as soft and indulgent, suggested that perhaps this strange comfort was a sign of weakness, a lack of the warrior spirit they had been taught to revere. Yet none could fully dismiss the growing unease, the nagging suspicion that things were simply not as they had been told. The mental framework, built by years of indoctrination, was beginning to show its first, fragile cracks. The initial days settled into a routine. Roll calls at dawn, supervised walks, instructions delivered in halting English, largely incomprehensible to most. But alongside this rigid structure came small, surprising details that chipped away further at their convictions. Guards did not strike them for faltering in line. They were permitted to write letters home through the Red Cross, a lifeline to a world they thought they had lost. One guard, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable had their positions been reversed, even offered a cigarette to a prisoner who had none. These fragments of humanity, tiny yet immensely significant, clashed violently with the image of the merciless enemy they had been ordered to fight to the death. The carefully constructed edifice of hatred began to waver, not collapsing, but subtly shifting on its foundations. The true turning point arrived with an announcement. They would soon be sent out to work, not in factories or mines, the grim industrial settings they might have anticipated, but on nearby farms. The news sent murmurs through the barracks, a wave of renewed dread. Farmers? The same farmers who must have lost sons, brothers, fathers, or husbands at Pearl Harbor and in the bloody battles beyond. The men exchanged glances, heavy with a fresh wave of fear. In their minds, this was it. This was where the true, unvarnished cruelty would finally reveal itself. Surely these civilians, raw with grief and vengeance, would spit on them, curse them, exploit them like beasts of burden, treating them with the contempt they felt they deserved for their nation's actions. No soldier in the Imperial Army had ever been trained for the possibility of kindness from an enemy's ordinary people. That night, the cicadas' song outside the wire seemed to mock their anxiety. Many of the prisoners found themselves unable to sleep, their minds racing with thoughts of the fields they had seen from the train, the barns painted bright red against the vast American sky. Tomorrow they would step out of the relative anonymity of captivity and face to face with a world that had every reason to despise them, and none, not a single one, could imagine that instead of vengeance, they would soon encounter words spoken with a gentleness they did not think possible after Pearl Harbor. When the first dawn broke over the camp, painting the sky with soft hues, the prisoners were herded into formation. The air was crisp, carrying the wholesome smell of tilled soil and freshly cut grass, a fragrance utterly foreign, yet strangely calming. The guards read out names, their voices sharp with command, but not cruel, then escorted small groups out through the gates. Beyond the wire, trucks waited, their engines rumbling softly, ready to take them deeper into the countryside. The men climbed aboard hesitantly, each step weighed down by a palpable dread, certain that humiliation and overt hostility awaited them. Yet, even before the trucks rolled, they noticed something peculiar. Farmers had come with their wagons, standing at a distance, not to jeer or shout, but to glance curiously at the men who had once been their enemies. Inside the trucks, the prisoners sat silently, their minds crowded with conflicting thoughts, a mental battleground where fear wrestled with a nascent, unwelcome curiosity. They imagined the faces of Americans who had lost relatives at Pearl Harbor, men and women who must have burned with incandescent anger at the sight of Japanese uniforms. They pictured rough hands, ready to strike them the moment they stepped down onto the soil. Some whispered quietly that perhaps the guards would deliberately turn their backs, allowing civilian vengeance to unfold unchecked, a bitter justice. But when the trucks jolted to a stop at a farm, what greeted them was not fists or curses. It was the profoundly ordinary scene of women hanging laundry on a line, children chasing each other near a fence, and a farmer wiping his brow before climbing down from his tractor. This domestic tableau, untouched by the immediate presence of war, was almost unnerving. It was as if they had been transported into a life that conflict had not ravaged, a stark contrast to their own war-torn homeland. The first hours were a test, a delicate dance between expectation and reality. The prisoners were shown rows of corn and fields of wheat, handed tools, and given instructions more through gestures than words. The guards remained nearby, rifles slung casually, present but not overtly threatening. They did not shout unless the men faltered badly, perhaps confusing a task. The work itself, though hard and physically demanding, was familiar. Many of the Japanese had come from farming villages back home, and though the crops were different, the rhythm of the soil, the intimate connection to the earth, was something they deeply understood. As they bent their backs to the fields, toiling under the foreign sun, a surprising realization dawned. Their lives were not being threatened. Instead, they were being treated as workers whose labor was needed, not as enemies to be broken or punished. At midday, when the sun pressed down hot and heavy, a break was announced. One farmer approached, carrying a pail of water. The prisoners froze, convinced that some trick, some subtle cruelty awaited them. Yet the farmer simply set the pail down, dipped a ladle, and gestured for them to drink. The water was cold, clean, and tasted of iron and earth. A simple, life-sustaining offering. For men who had braced themselves for mockery or poison, the act was utterly disarming. The farmer did not speak much, only nodded once before stepping back, but the silence itself carried no hostility. It was a silence of acceptance, of seeing them not as monsters but as men, laborers in need of refreshment. When they returned to the camp that evening, the barracks buzzed with whispered conversations, a low hum of disbelief and nascent wonder. Each prisoner relayed what he had seen. The way children had pointed but not spat, how women had continued their chores without fear, how the farmer had offered water without insult. Some laughed nervously, a brittle sound of confusion. Others frowned, their brows furrowed in a profound bewilderment. How could this be possible? They had been told Americans were ruthless, vengeful, but the evidence of their own eyes suggested otherwise. It was only the beginning, but already their deeply entrenched minds were beginning to shift. Still, doubts lingered, tenacious and deeply rooted. Many insisted that this civility must be temporary, a fleeting anomaly, that once the novelty wore off, the underlying anger would surely surface. They reminded each other of the attack on Pearl Harbor, of the thousands of lives lost that December morning. Surely no nation, no people, could forgive such a profound wound so easily. But as they lay on their bunks, sore from honest work rather than punitive labor, a quiet question gnawed inside them, a question more unsettling than any physical discomfort. What if the Americans were not as their officers, their propaganda had described? What if there was something deeper behind these small gestures, something they had not been prepared to face, something that transcended the brutality of war itself? The next morning, the guards once again called the prisoners into formation, and soon they were marched to the waiting trucks. By now, the tension in the men's shoulders was subtly mingled with a cautious curiosity, a flicker of hope, or at least a desperate need to understand. The memory of the farmer who had offered them water lingered, a stark image against their expectations. Could it have been a mere accident of kindness, an isolated act of an individual? Or was there a deeper pattern to this strange civility, a fundamental truth about these people they had been taught to despise? As the trucks rumbled down dusty rural roads, the prisoners stared out at the passing fields, watching farmers tending their cattle, tractors crawling slowly across the fertile earth. Unlike the battlefields they had left behind, this was a land consumed not by fire and death, but by planting and harvest, a cycle of life and renewal that seemed profoundly distant from the war. Their destination that day was another farm, larger than the first. The farmer there was a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin, his face a canvas of years spent under the open sky. He did not greet them with hostility, though neither did he offer a smile. Instead, he gestured to the rows of sugar beets and beans, his voice even and calm as he gave instructions to the guards. The prisoners were handed shovels and sacks, and soon the familiar rhythm of work began again. What struck them most, however, was not the labor itself, but the farmer's presence. He remained nearby, watching as the men bent low and dug into the soil, but his gaze lacked malice. It was practical, assessing, as if he saw them not as enemies, but as extra hands. Vital labor needed to keep his farm alive and productive. Hours passed beneath the rising sun. Sweat ran down their backs, and blisters formed on their palms. But still the farmer did not lash out, nor did he look at them with the burning hatred they had expected. Instead, when one of the younger prisoners stumbled from exhaustion, the farmer simply motioned for him to rest near the fence. The guards allowed it without protest, another small act of unexpected leniency. Soon after, the farmer's wife appeared, carrying a jug of milk and a basket of bread. She approached the guards first, offering them food, and then, hesitating only slightly, she turned toward the prisoners. To their astonishment, she placed the jug and bread on the ground within reach, nodding for them to take it. The men exchanged bewildered glances before one, cautiously, broke off a piece of bread. It was fresh, soft, and utterly unlike anything they had eaten in months. The act was almost unbearable in its strangeness. Bread and milk, the very symbols of simple domestic kindness, given to men who had fought under a flag that brought death and destruction to Pearl Harbor. The prisoners ate silently, each bite heavy with confusion, shame, and a nascent, painful understanding. Some could not meet the woman's eyes, ashamed at accepting generosity from those they had wronged. Others chewed slowly, wondering if this was yet another test. Yet nothing followed. No cruelty, no laughter of derision, no insult, only the hum of bees in the fields and the creak of the farmer's boots as he returned to his work. As the day wore on, the men began to notice smaller details they had missed before, details that spoke volumes. The farmer's children peeked from behind the doorway of the house, curious but not fearful. A dog wandered close to sniff at the strangers in ragged uniforms, wagging its tail without prejudice. The wife occasionally glanced their way, her face calm, her hands busy with chores. It was as though the war, with all its fury and hatred, had not managed to erase the ordinary humanity of this family, even when standing face to face with those once called enemies. That evening, when the prisoners were driven back to the camp, they carried more than just sore muscles with them. They carried an unsettling question that now pressed harder than before, echoing in the quiet of their barracks. Why would Americans, who had lost so much at Pearl Harbor and in battles across the Pacific, choose to treat them with such decency? The answer eluded them, a profound mystery. But the seeds of doubt about everything they had been told about the enemy, had already been planted deep within their hearts and minds. By the third week of farm labor, the prisoners had settled into a rhythm, a daily routine that intertwined their captivity with the cadences of agricultural life. Each morning they were driven out beyond the wire, past barns painted in fading red, and fields heavy with crops. They worked under the relentless sun, shoulders bent, hands raw. But what unsettled them most was not the toil, it was the behavior of the farmers. One would have expected scorn, harsh words, or even open hostility. Instead, they were met with a quiet, unwavering civility, a simple "good morning," uttered in a soft, steady voice, struck the men with the force of a physical blow. It happened first when an older farmer whose son had served in the Pacific greeted the group with a nod and a few words of English that even the prisoners could understand. Work well, eat later. There was no sneer, no venom in the tone, only practicality laced with something startlingly close to kindness. The Japanese men exchanged wary glances, uncertain whether to trust their ears. How could this man, who surely read about Pearl Harbor in his newspapers, and perhaps had buried a nephew or cousin who died in the war, speak to them as if they were merely workers hired for the season? As days passed, these small gestures multiplied, becoming a pattern rather than an anomaly. Farmers gave directions without raising their voices. When mistakes were made, rows planted unevenly, tools dropped, tasks misunderstood, the corrections were firm but never cruel. One farmer even attempted a smile, a quick flash across his weathered face when a prisoner struggled to lift a heavy sack, and another rushed to help. The Japanese were deeply confused. In their own homeland, prisoners, if they were taken at all, were often treated brutally, considered dishonored and unworthy of life. Here, their captors seemed bound by an invisible code that demanded restraint, and, at times, compassion. For the prisoners, the shock was doubled by the persistent memory of Pearl Harbor. That day had been drilled into them, even during captivity. The proud strike that drew America into the war, the symbol of Japanese strength. And yet, Pearl Harbor was also the wound that every American carried, a collective scar. The prisoners simply could not comprehend how men and women living under the shadow of that event could speak to them, feed them, or even simply acknowledge them without spitting hatred. It seemed unnatural, as though the farmers were deliberately denying the powerful emotions the prisoners expected to face. One afternoon, as the men worked in a soybean field, a farmer's wife approached, carrying a basket of apples. She handed a few to the guards, and then, to the prisoners' utter disbelief, she offered the basket to them as well. The moment was frozen in time. Japanese soldiers, once sworn enemies of the American people, now biting into crisp fruit handed to them by the very people they thought would despise them most. The sweetness of the apples seemed almost unbearable, a taste of forbidden grace. Some ate quickly, others hesitated, but none could ignore the truth of the gesture. It was an act of kindness that pierced deeper than any blade, a profound challenge to their understanding of the world. These encounters left the men restless at night. They whispered in their barracks, voices hushed and tense. Why are they like this? One would ask, grappling with the incomprehensible. Another would reply, perhaps it is a trap, the ingrained suspicion hard to shed. But no trap ever came. The kindness was repeated day after day, ordinary and unremarkable to the farmers themselves, yet monumental to the prisoners. Slowly, the sharp edges of fear dulled, replaced by a weary respect for these people who treated them with dignity, despite every conceivable reason to hate them. The realization sank in with a crushing weight. The Americans were not merely powerful in industry and weapons. They were powerful in spirit, in a way the prisoners had never conceived. And for the Japanese prisoners who had been raised on tales of merciless enemies, this discovery was more unsettling than any battlefield defeat. Let us pause for a moment to consider the broader human context, for this story is not an isolated anomaly. Throughout history, even in the darkest hours of conflict, individual acts of unexpected humanity have pierced through the fog of war, challenging the very notion of absolute enmity. One of the most famous examples is the Christmas Truce of 1914. During World War I, on the Western Front, after months of horrific trench warfare, on Christmas Eve, soldiers from opposing sides, German, British, French, spontaneously began to put down their weapons. Carols were sung across no man's land, then gifts exchanged. Cigarettes, chocolate, even plum puddings were passed from hand to hand. Soldiers who had been shooting at each other hours before now shook hands, showed each other pictures of their families, and even played impromptu games of football in the freezing mud. This was not an official ceasefire. It was a grassroots uprising of human decency, a refusal by ordinary men to continue hating each other when faced with shared vulnerability and the spirit of the season. Commanders on both sides were appalled, fearing a breakdown of discipline. They quickly moved to prevent such fraternization from ever happening again. But the fact that it happened at all, that thousands of individuals chose empathy over enmity, speaks volumes. It highlights a universal human capacity to recognize the shared humanity of others, even those demonized by propaganda and positioned as enemies. Just like the Japanese POWs, these soldiers were taught to dehumanize their adversaries. Yet, when confronted with the tangible reality of another man, a face, a laugh, a shared moment of peace, the dehumanization faltered. The Christmas truce, like the story of the Japanese POWs, demonstrates that the lines we draw between us and them are often far more fragile than we believe, and that individual acts of compassion can shatter them, if only for a fleeting moment. Another poignant illustration comes from the chilling backdrop of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Again, during the World War II. Amidst the brutal winter and the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, a German mother, Elisabeth Weinken, and her 12-year-old son, Fritz, were celebrating Christmas Eve in their small, isolated cabin near the front lines. 3 American soldiers, lost and freezing, stumbled upon their cabin, seeking shelter. Despite the raging war and the obvious danger, Elizabeth, a devout woman, welcomed them, offering warmth and food, stressing that it was Christmas Eve, and there would be no shooting here. Shortly after, 3 German soldiers, also lost and desperate, arrived. Fritz initially panicked, thinking their lives were over, but Elizabeth, with incredible courage and unwavering conviction, reiterated her Christmas truce. "You are all tired and hungry, and you can eat as much as you like, but you cannot shoot anyone here." She made them surrender their weapons at the door, side by side with the Americans' rifles. For one extraordinary night, these sworn enemies, men who would undoubtedly have killed each other on sight just outside the cabin, shared a meal, shared stories, and found common ground in the simple act of survival and shared humanity. They even shared a prayer. The German sergeant, a former medical student, tended to a wounded American. In the morning, the German soldiers gave the Americans a compass and directions back to Allied lines, cautioning them about where their own troops would be. before parting ways. This incredible incident, attested to by Fritz Wencken decades later, stands as a powerful testament to the individual's capacity for compassion to transcend the dictates of war, creating a temporary sanctuary of peace where it seemed utterly impossible. These stories, much like the experience of the Japanese POWs, reveal that human connection is not an abstract ideal, but a powerful, often subversive force in times of conflict. It's a reminder that beneath the uniforms, the flags, the propaganda, and the shared national identities, there exists a fundamental human core that can respond to kindness, even when deeply conditioned to expect malice. It's about the courage of individuals. A farmer offering water, a woman sharing bread, a mother demanding peace, to act according to a higher moral imperative than the one dictated by war. By midsummer, the rhythm of captivity was no longer defined solely by fences and guards, but by the cadence of work in the fields, a deeply ingrained, almost ritualistic pattern of labor. The Japanese prisoners rose with the dawn, rode in the trucks past silent towns, and found themselves working side by side with American farmers whose mannerisms remained disarmingly calm. What astonished the men most was not just the absence of hatred, which by now had become a strange, uncomfortable norm, but the presence of ordinary human exchanges that chipped away, day by day, at the formidable wall between captor and captive. It began with greetings. Farmers, their hands roughened from years of toil, would nod and say, "Good morning," as the prisoners stepped onto their soil. Though most of the Japanese did not understand the exact words, they recognized the tone. Gentle, neutral, utterly devoid of venom. The first time it happened, many looked away in shame, uncertain how to respond, having been taught only to defy or die. But as the days lengthened, some dared to bow slightly in return, the only gesture they knew to convey respect, a tentative bridge across the chasm of language and conflict. Soon, these greetings became routine, subtle acknowledgments of shared humanity in the midst of war. Meals brought further encounters, deepening the unexpected connections. At midday, when the sun burned relentlessly above, the farmers would pause for their lunch. The prisoners were given rations of bread, beans, or potatoes by their guards. Yet, occasionally, a farmer would share a piece of fruit or pass along a canteen of water. Simple acts that spoke volumes. Once, a boy, barely 10 years old, perhaps the farmer's son, approached the line of prisoners with a basket of peaches from his family's orchard. He handed them out nervously, his wide eyes darting between the men's sunburnt faces, a mix of curiosity and shyness. None of the prisoners could speak to him, but they accepted the fruit with quiet reverence, a profound moment of connection. The sweetness of those peaches lingered far longer than the taste, a poignant reminder that not all hearts had hardened, even in wartime, and that innocence could pierce through the most hardened defenses. The work itself often demanded cooperation, a forced collaboration that slowly eroded barriers. Though guards supervised from a distance, it was the farmers who instructed them, showing them how to handle machinery, where to cut rows, or how to harvest crops efficiently. Some prisoners, eager to demonstrate their value, mimicked the gestures quickly, proving their capability. A few even tried their broken English. "Like this?" they would ask haltingly, their accents heavy, their grammar fractured. The farmers, to the surprise of many, would nod and sometimes chuckle softly when the words came out wrong, not with scorn, but with a shared sense of amusement at the effort. These small exchanges, clumsy though they were, carried immense weight. For the Japanese, who had been told to expect only cruelty, hearing a laugh not laced with derision, but with genuine, shared human mirth, was a revelation. It was a sign that they were being seen, not just as instruments of labor, but as fellow human beings, capable of error and deserving of understanding. Not all moments were easy, of course. There were times when tempers flared, tools dropped, tasks misunderstood, orders repeated too many times. Yet, even then, the farmers rarely raised their voices, exhibiting a patience that baffled the prisoners. One day, a prisoner accidentally snapped the handle of a hoe. He braced for a beating, for he knew that in his own army, such an error would have drawn harsh, immediate punishment. Instead, the farmer simply took the broken handle, shrugged with a weary resignation, and fetched another tool. No insult, no blow, only a tired sigh. That night, in the barracks, the man confessed that he had felt more shame from that simple shrug, that quiet acceptance of a mistake, than from any physical strike. It was a shame born of the realization that he was being treated with a dignity he had not afforded himself in anticipating punishment. The prisoners slowly realized they were not invisible shadows in these fields. They were being acknowledged, spoken to, and treated with a dignity they had not expected. Every nod, every shared piece of fruit, every laugh over a clumsy attempt at English became part of a complex mosaic that profoundly contradicted everything drilled into them during the war. And with each passing day, the kindness of the farmers, in its quiet, unassuming persistence, cut deeper than any weapon could. It made them question not only the enemy, but also themselves, their own ingrained beliefs, and the very foundation of their worldview. As the weeks stretched into months, the barrier between prisoner and farmer began to thin in ways none of the men had foreseen. At first, the exchanges were silent. Gestures, nods, the passing of tools. But gradually, words began to slip into the air, tentative and fragile. A handful of the younger Japanese prisoners had studied some English in school. Learning fragments of vocabulary meant more for decoding enemy propaganda than for actual conversation. They tested these words cautiously, their accents heavy, their grammar fractured, but the farmers responded with remarkable patience, meeting their efforts with understanding rather than ridicule. One farmer, noticing a prisoner struggling to carry a sack of grain, tapped his own chest and said, "Heavy?" The word echoed in the prisoner's mind, simple yet clear. He repeated it clumsily, drawing a genuine smile from the farmer, a moment of shared understanding that transcended language. Another prisoner, curious about the names of vegetables, pointed at carrots and asked, "Name?" The farmer knelt down, pulled one from the soil, and repeated, "Carrot, carrot." The men murmured the word among themselves, savoring it like a secret code, a key to a world they were slowly, painfully beginning to understand. For the Japanese, language was not just a tool, but a fragile bridge across an unthinkable divide. They had expected only anger from these civilians, yet the farmers seemed eager to teach them small pieces of their world. Some even laughed when the prisoners tried and failed to pronounce words correctly. Not a cruel laugh, but one that acknowledged shared effort, a universal human bond in the act of learning. It was profoundly disarming. Curiosity, that most fundamental human trait, worked both ways. In quiet moments when the guard's attention wavered, farmers asked simple questions. Japan, they would say, pointing at the prisoners, then miming a question with their hands. A few men nodded, fumbling to describe their villages, their families, their homes by using gestures, drawing shapes in the dirt. Mountains, houses, even a crude sketch of the Japanese flag. The farmers studied these drawings with genuine interest, as if trying to imagine lives far across the Pacific, lives that were not so different from their own. One day, during a midday break, an elderly farmer attempted something daring, something profoundly personal. He sat on a fence rail, lit his pipe, and asked a prisoner, "Family?" The man hesitated, unsure whether to answer, for in the imperial army, to admit weakness or speak openly of family was discouraged, even forbidden, lest it soften a warrior's resolve. But finally he whispered in broken English, "Wife, 2 children." He pointed eastward, toward a land he could no longer reach, a family he might never see again. The farmer nodded slowly, tapping his own chest as if to say he too had a family, children, and a wife waiting for him. No more words were needed. In that moment, the 2 men, once enemy and victim, were only fathers, husbands, separated by oceans and war, bound by the universal experience of familial love and longing. These exchanges shook the prisoners deeply. Here, on American soil, a simple question opened a wound and offered comfort at the same time. The kindness of these farmers, their willingness to see them as human beings, forced the Japanese to confront truths they had been trained to ignore. That their enemies were not faceless demons, but human beings with lives, losses, and loves much like their own. At night, the barracks buzzed with stories of these encounters. Some prisoners, clinging to their ingrained ideology, mocked the farmers as soft, insisting the Americans lacked the true warrior spirit. Others, however, spoke quietly of how these conversations unsettled them, how they exposed the hollowness of their propaganda. They compared it with the harsh discipline of their own officers, who had never spoken kindly, who would have punished even a stumble in speech or step. The contrast gnawed at them, raising questions none dared to voice too loudly. Had they been misled all along about the true nature of their enemy? Had their unwavering faith been built on a foundation of lies? By the time autumn leaves began to fall across the fields, painting the landscape in hues of red and gold, the farmers and the prisoners had built a fragile, strange bond, one stitched together with broken English, shy nods, and gestures across the immense gulf of war. And for the Japanese, each word learned, each small gesture understood, carried more than simple meaning. It carried the overwhelming weight of a revelation. That kindness could exist even where history screamed it should not. A stark contrast to the narratives of hatred that had defined their lives. As winter crept toward the countryside, blanketing the barns and fields in a pristine layer of snow, the air turned sharp and cold. Yet the farmers continued to treat them with the same quiet decency as they had in summer. The rhythm of labor shifted, less planting, more maintenance, mending fences, tending to animals. But the gestures of civility remained constant. For the Japanese men, each passing week deepened a sense of confusion that pressed heavily against the rigid discipline and ideology drilled into them by their homeland. In whispered conversations after lights out, beneath the thin blankets in their barracks, they compared their treatment here with what they knew, what they had witnessed, of their own army's handling of captives. Many had heard first-hand accounts from comrades who had guarded prisoners in China or the Philippines. The Japanese code of war left little room for compassion. Captured enemies were often beaten, starved, or left to perish, deemed to have forfeited their right to life. To be a prisoner was shameful, almost less than human. And yet here, thousands of miles from home, they were being given food, clean bunks, blankets, and even kind words from those who had lost brothers and sons at the Pearl Harbor. The contradiction was unbearable for some, a profound psychological burden, yet for others it was slowly becoming liberating, loosening the chains of dogma. One man, formerly a petty officer, admitted quietly, his voice barely a whisper, that he could not reconcile the memory of his training with the reality before him. We were told Americans had no honor, he confessed. But these farmers, they bow their heads in respect when they pass their own dead in the cemetery. They treat us like men, not animals. His voice trembled, for he knew such words could be considered treasonous in another setting, a betrayal of everything he was taught to believe. But here, inside the barracks of an American camp, surrounded by men grappling with the same profound questions, his words resonated with a painful truth. Others nodded in agreement, even if they lacked the courage to say the same aloud, their silence a powerful testament to their shared internal struggle. The contrast sharpened whenever they read letters from home. Through the Red Cross, some received brief notes, written in careful script, reminding them of the desperate shortages in Japan, of families struggling to survive, of the brutal winter awaiting them if the war dragged on. They imagined their wives and children scavenging for scraps, enduring hunger and hardship, while they themselves ate bread and meat in a foreign land. Guilt mixed with an ever-growing astonishment. How could their enemy, who bombed Tokyo and sank their ships, show more mercy and provide more sustenance to them than their own officers ever would? The farmers, meanwhile, seemed to sense this profound internal conflict without needing words. They did not taunt the prisoners with their kindness, nor did they make dramatic, self-congratulatory gestures of forgiveness. Instead, they offered something subtler, yet far more potent: constancy. A steady nod each morning, a quiet good work when tasks were done, a brief moment of shared laughter when a cow nudged a prisoner too close to the fence. These were small things, almost imperceptible in isolation, but they were relentless, impossible to ignore. The repetition itself forced the Japanese men to acknowledge a reality they had never prepared for, a reality that defied every fiber of their being, an enemy who refused to hate them, even when every rational reason for hatred was present. By December, the memory of Pearl Harbor had reached its 3rd anniversary. Newspapers in America still carried solemn reminders of that day, commemorative articles, photographs of destruction, stories of sacrifice. Yet, in the fields where the prisoners worked, no bitterness was voiced. Some farmers had undoubtedly lost sons who had died in the Pacific, in the very battles these prisoners had fought in. And yet, they still spoke calmly to the very men whose empire had inflicted that loss. For the prisoners, this silence, this absence of expected vitriol, was louder than any insult. It revealed a strength that profoundly unsettled them, a strength to choose dignity over vengeance, to prioritize humanity over hatred. In their reflections, many came to a quiet, painful conclusion. America's true power was not just in its factories, its planes, or its weapons. It was in the ordinary people who, despite their profound grief, still treated strangers with humanity. And this, more than any battle or bomb, left the prisoners unable to reconcile what they had been taught with what they were living. When the war finally drew to its close, the atmosphere in the camps shifted, a palpable change in the air. News filtered in slowly. Whispers from guards, headlines glimpsed in discarded newspapers, the solemn, devastating announcement of Japan's surrender. For the prisoners, it was a moment both crushing and liberating. Their proud, defiant nation had fallen. Yet, they themselves were alive, standing in the heart of the enemy's land, treated with a decency they could still scarcely comprehend. As repatriation loomed, they began to prepare for a return to a homeland in ruins, carrying with them stories no one at home would easily believe, tales of an enemy unlike any they had been told to expect. The last weeks on American farms were heavy with reflection, a period of profound contemplation. Prisoners walked the same fields they had tended through the seasons, now with the knowledge that their labor was ending, that this strange chapter of their lives was drawing to a close. The farmers, too, seemed to understand the weight of the moment. Some spoke a few extra words, offering simple blessings like good luck or safe home. Others gave small parting gifts, not grand gestures, but deeply personal tokens. An apple, a pair of worn but still useful gloves, even a folded handkerchief. These seemingly insignificant items struck the prisoners more deeply than medals or speeches ever could, symbols of a connection forged not through words, but through shared labor and unspoken respect. On the day of departure, trucks once again waited to take the men away. They climbed aboard, carrying their meager personal belongings, but also carrying memories they could not pack away, memories etched permanently into their souls. As the trucks rolled through the countryside for the last time, many craned their necks for a final glimpse of the farms, the fields, the barns that had become their unexpected sanctuary. In some places, farmers stood by their gates, lifting a hand in a silent farewell. One elderly man, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, removed his hat, holding it to his chest until the convoy disappeared down the dusty road. The prisoners, overcome with emotion, bowed their heads in return, a gesture of respect that transcended language, culture, and the bitter divisions of war. The voyage back across the Pacific was filled with an uneasy anticipation, a mix of hope and dread for the unknown future. The men whispered about what awaited them in Japan: bombed-out cities, hungry families, the crushing shame of surrender, the overwhelming task of rebuilding a shattered nation. Yet, again and again, their conversations returned to the farmers, the indelible images of their unexpected kindness. They spoke of the first cold water offered in the fields, of the boy who had shared peaches, of the women who gave them bread without fear, without a trace of the hatred they had been conditioned to expect. They spoke, too, of the words spoken kindly, even though Pearl Harbor had left scars that still bled in the American heart. For many, these memories were more bewildering, more profoundly challenging than the defeat itself. When they finally disembarked in Japan, their stories, these incredible, almost unbelievable narratives of compassion in captivity, spread among friends and family. Some listeners shook their heads in disbelief, unwilling to accept that Americans, painted for so long as devils, could show such unexpected kindness. The propaganda was too deeply ingrained. Others grew quiet, troubled by the implications, by the uncomfortable truth that their perceived enemies were far more complex than they had been led to believe. For the prisoners themselves, the memories remained vivid, etched deeper than the wounds of war. They had been spared cruelty, not by politicians or generals, not by grand decrees or peace treaties, but by ordinary men and women who had every reason to hate them, yet chose to act otherwise. In the years to come, some of these former prisoners would write of their experiences, testifying that they had discovered humanity in the unlikeliest of places. They carried with them not just tales of survival, but profound lessons of humility, compassion, and the life-altering realization that war, with all its dehumanizing power, could not erase the fundamental decency of individuals. Even Pearl Harbor, with all its fury and grief, had not hardened every American heart beyond the reach of empathy. The war had taught them to expect only hatred, a relentless, all-consuming animosity. Yet, in the quiet, unassuming fields of rural America, they found something else entirely. It was a truth that haunted them, shaped them, and stayed with them long after the guns had gone silent, long after the world had begun to rebuild. The lesson from this extraordinary chapter of history is both simple and profound. Kindness, quietly spoken by farmers in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, had the power to disarm more deeply than any weapon ever could. It teaches us that the capacity for humanity, for empathy, for choosing connection over division, is a persistent and powerful force. Even in the most extreme circumstances, it challenges us to look beyond the labels of enemy or other, and to recognize the shared human experience that binds us all. In a world still grappling with conflict and division, this story serves as an enduring beacon of hope, a reminder that the seeds of peace are often sown not in grand diplomatic gestures, but in the small, courageous acts of individuals who dare to see the human being before the uniform, the face before the ideology, and the shared spirit that can, even if fleetingly, transcend the bitterest of wars. It urges us to remember that the true measure of a society's strength, and indeed of our individual character, lies not in its ability to inflict harm, but in its capacity to extend kindness, even to those who may seem to deserve it least.